Somewhere in New York City, on the 11th floor of Beth Israel Medical Center, a woman spent her days watching cartoons, arranging dolls, and occasionally chatting in French with the one nurse she trusted. Outside her window, the city moved at its usual speed. Cabs, crowds, noise, life. She never looked out. She kept the shades drawn. Her name was Hugette Clark. She was one of the wealthiest women in America. She owned 3 grand estates she never visited, a 42-room apartment overlooking Central Park she hadn't set foot in for years, and a fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars she barely touched. She had checked herself into that hospital room in 1991. She never left. The part that has always stuck with people, the part that still doesn't quite make sense, is that she wasn't sick. She wasn't frail or confused. She was, by most accounts, sharp, funny, and perfectly lucid. She just didn't want to go home. What happened to Hugette Clark is not a simple story. It starts over a century ago, in a Paris apartment, with a father who controlled copper empires and a little girl who loved dolls. And it ends in a hospital bed, 2 weeks before her 105th birthday, with almost no one by her side who shared her blood. The story of how she got from one to the other is the part worth knowing. Segment 10. The Copper King, the fortune that started it all. To understand Hugette Clark, you first have to understand her father, because what William Andrews Clark built set the terms of her entire life before she was old enough to have opinions of her own. Clark was born in 1839 in Pennsylvania and made his way west during the mining rushes. He figured out early that the fastest way to profit from a gold rush is to sell things to the miners, not dig alongside them. He bought eggs at market price and sold them back to Montana miners at many times that. He found profit in every corner of the frontier. But the real money came from copper. In Butte, Montana, Clark recognized before almost anyone else that the coming electrical age would need copper wire, and Butte sat on one of the richest deposits on Earth. He built mines, smelters, railroads, and assembled one of the most powerful industrial empires in the country. At his peak, he was the second richest man in America, behind only John D. Rockefeller. Mark Twain wrote about Clark in terms that left nothing to the imagination, placing him among the most corrupt figures in American public life. He was notorious for 1899, when he reportedly distributed envelopes of cash to Montana state legislators to secure his election to the United States Senate. The scandal forced him to resign before being seated. He eventually returned to the Senate, but the story followed him. He was a man who believed money could buy essentially anything. On Fifth Avenue in New York City, he built a mansion so excessive even the Gilded Age found it remarkable. 121 rooms, multiple art galleries, a private theatre, marble staircases, and an underground coal railway. It cost approximately $7 million. New Yorkers called it Clark's Folly. He had been snubbed by the social elite and responded by building something they couldn't ignore. This was the man who, at 67, became a father for the last time. His second wife was Anna LaChapelle, born in 1878, the daughter of French-Canadian immigrants. She had come into Clark's orbit as a young woman after her own father's death, described in accounts of the time as having been his ward. They married secretly in France in 1901, a union that became public in 1904 and drew scrutiny given the 39-year age difference. Together, they had 2 daughters, Andrée, born in 1902, and Huguette Marcel Clark, born June 9, 1906, in Paris. The name came from the street where they kept their Paris apartment, the Avenue Victor Hugo, a world of gilded rooms, European tutors, and violin lessons. Absolute privilege, but more fragile than it appeared. The first cracks came from the one place all that money couldn't protect against. Segment 9. A Sister and a Shadow. The Loss That Never Healed. Hugette Clark was 5 years old when the family moved from Paris to New York City in 1911. The life she entered was extraordinary. Art galleries filled with Renoir, Degas, Monet, Cézanne, a staff of dozens, a floor kept in reserve against epidemic. And yet, for all the marble and all the paintings, what mattered most to young Huguette was far simpler: her older sister. André Clark was 4 years older, and the two girls were inseparable. They shared a bedroom in the 121-room mansion, a detail that says more than any description could. Huguette was already shy by temperament, preferring quiet play to any kind of public performance. André was her anchor. In 1919, André Clark fell ill with meningitis. She was 16 years old, just days from her 17th birthday. She died. Huguette was 13. The effect was not something that resolved over time. In the family's Santa Barbara estate, Bello Sguardo, portraits of André hung in nearly every room, sometimes two to a room, her deep-set eyes following you through the house. The bird refuge Huguette funded in Santa Barbara in 1928 was named the André Clark Bird Refuge. A cottage on the property bore her name. A summer camp in Briarcliff Manor, New York, donated by her parents in André's memory, was called Camp André Clark. Huguette spent decades keeping her sister's name attached to permanent things, as if permanence could prevent the person from disappearing entirely. Her father was in his 80s when André died, elderly and distant in the ways that matter most. In 1925, William Andrews Clark died of pneumonia in his Fifth Avenue house at the age of 86. Huguette was 18. Before he went, he had told her something she never forgot: that the fortune she would inherit meant she could never be entirely sure of the people around her. No one would truly love her, he said. She had to be careful. It was a cruel thing to tell a teenager who had already lost her sister. It was also, coming from a man who had bought his Senate seat, a statement of his own experience. Huguette and her mother Anna moved to an apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue. The mansion was demolished in 1927. What remained was the money, the art, the properties, and two women who had learned to be each other's primary company. The shape of what Huguette's life would eventually become was already visible. But there was still one more chapter to get through first: a marriage that was brief, strange, and would leave its own marks. Segment 8. The Marriage That Wasn't. William Gower and the Beginning of Withdrawal. In December 1927, the Society pages of New York announced the engagement of Huguette Clark to William MacDonald Gower, a Princeton graduate, a law student, and the son of one of William Andrews Clark's longtime business associates. On paper, a sensible match. They were married on August 18, 1928, at Bello Sguardo, the Clark estate in Santa Barbara. Huguette was 22. The marriage lasted less than a year before the couple separated. They divorced in Reno, Nevada, on August 11, 1930. The filing cited desertion. But more came out around the time of the proceedings. Gower's account was that the marriage had never been consummated. Some accounts suggested that Anna, Huguette's mother, had effectively paid Gower a substantial sum to marry her daughter in the first place. Whether entirely accurate or partially embellished, the picture that emerged was of a marriage that had been a transaction from the start, with an emotional foundation that was never really there. Huguette did not grieve its end. She returned to 907 Fifth Avenue, expanded the apartment to nearly 2 full floors and 42 rooms, and stayed. The last confirmed photograph of her dates to around 1930. a composed young woman in a dress that suggests someone dressing carefully for an occasion they're not entirely comfortable with. After that, the photographic record simply stops. She was 24 when the divorce was finalized. She never married again. The 1930s and 1940s brought some remaining social life, painting lessons, the occasional Dior show attended specifically to find inspiration for her dolls' wardrobes, but the direction was already set. She was retreating. Not dramatically, not all at once, steadily, incrementally, the way a tide goes out. Her constant companion was her mother. Anna and Huguette became almost a closed system. Two women in a vast apartment, living in French, their world growing quieter with each passing year. When that world was occasionally disturbed, it pushed Huguette further inward. And one particular disturbance, in the early 1940s, marked a turning point from which she never quite recovered. Segment 7. The World Outside. Shadows and the Slow Disappearance. The 1940s brought disruptions that a woman already inclined towards seclusion found difficult to manage. Huguette had a genuine and deep love of Japanese art and culture. She collected Japanese dolls, studied Japanese history, and built connections to Japanese artists. In the period of intense wartime suspicion following Pearl Harbor, that connection attracted official attention. The FBI conducted an interrogation regarding her ties to Japan. The exact details are not fully documented, but the effect on Huguette was significant. Some accounts describe the experience as contributing to a breakdown, a period of severe strain that deepened her distrust of the outside world and her reluctance to engage with it. Through the 1950s, she still visited Bellosguardo regularly, the Santa Barbara estate her mother Anna had rebuilt in the 1930s. 27 rooms of French Riviera design, set on 23 oceanfront acres. She painted in her studio, walked the grounds. The last visit she made to Bellosguardo was in 1953. She was 47 years old. She never went back. Her social life by this point had reduced to a particular kind of minimum. She attended Christian Dior fashion shows, not for herself, but to find inspiration for her dolls' wardrobes. When the French consul general spotted her name on the guest list for one show, he told a Dior representative she wouldn't come. She never went out, he said. She was his aunt by marriage, and she was a recluse. The representative corrected him. She came for the dolls. Her relationship with the dolls was not a symptom of disorder. It was an art practice, a form of focused engagement with beauty on her own terms. She commissioned elaborate miniature Japanese theatre sets, directed their arrangement with precision through written instructions to her assistant, and owned pieces ranging from antique French bisque dolls worth tens of thousands of dollars each to Barbie dolls and Smurfs figurines. When asked about this later, her personal assistant Christopher Sattler made the point that no one questioned Jay Leno for owning several hundred automobiles. The collecting impulse was not strange. The tenderness and specificity with which Huguette pursued it made it something close to its own private world. She was also a serious painter. She had studied with Tadeusz Steicher, a renowned Polish portrait painter, and exhibited her work at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington in 1929, and later in Paris. People who saw her paintings described genuine talent, precision, and emotional depth that went well beyond the achievements of a wealthy amateur, but all of it took place inside. And in 1963, the last remaining connection Huguette had to any daily human intimacy disappeared. Segment 6. Alone in the Gilded Cage. The years after her mother. Anna Clark died in 1963 at the age of 85. Huguette was 57 years old. The effect was immediate and total. People who had known Huguette in any capacity during the years before her mother's death noted afterward that something had simply closed. She became, in the truest sense, a recluse, not just private, not just selective about company, but genuinely withdrawn from the world in a way that had no exceptions. She was not seen outside her apartment again. The few visitors who had occasionally been permitted, a goddaughter, a distant family member, a trusted employee, were gradually phased out. Her staff at the apartment were eventually instructed to arrange themselves so that they never actually saw her. She would be in one room when they worked in another. When they needed to communicate, they communicated through notes slipped under doors. She spoke French to her staff, and only French, because she worried that English-speaking servants might repeat things they overheard. The apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue became a place of extraordinary privacy. 42 rooms, maintained at full readiness, tended by people who rarely, if ever, saw the woman for whom all of it was kept. She read the New York Times every morning. She watched television, the Flintstones, Rocky and Bullwinkle, the Forsyte Saga, the Dick Cavett Show. She used early recording technology, when it became available, to tape shows she liked, and she reportedly shipped 37 boxes of television recordings to her ex-husband, William Gower, who had moved to the south of France after their divorce, and with whom she had maintained an improbable distant connection. He sent back a grateful but somewhat startled note asking for customs documentation. She gave generously and continuously to people she cared about. She funded the bird refuge in Santa Barbara in memory of André. She gave money to museums and arts organizations and quietly helped individuals she read about in the newspaper who were struggling. She was not a bitter woman or a hard woman. She was, by all accounts, funny and warm in her phone conversations, curious about the world, interested in people's lives. She just didn't want to be in it. Her closest friend outside the apartment was a woman named Suzanne Pierre, who had once worked for her and who remained in contact for decades. Her goddaughter Wanda Steicher also stayed in touch. And when Wanda asked Huguette directly why she didn't go out anymore, Huguette told her simply that she didn't want to. There was no anguish in the statement, no appeal for understanding, just the plain declaration of a woman who had made her choice. What she could not do, in the years after her mother's death, was acknowledge the slow deterioration of her own body. She had no physician. She had no one who might notice the things that were quietly going wrong. By the late 1980s, she was in her 80s, and the consequences of decades without medical care were beginning to show. When she finally emerged, it was not by choice, it was by necessity. And the state in which she emerged would shock even the people who thought they already understood how thoroughly she had disappeared. Segment 5. The Hospital. A room with no exit. In March 1991, Hugette Clark was admitted to Doctors' Hospital on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. She was 84 years old, and she had not seen a physician in many years. What the medical staff encountered when she arrived was not easy to describe. She was severely underweight. Her face had been ravaged by basal cell carcinoma, a type of skin cancer that, left untreated for long enough, carves deep and disfiguring wounds into the tissue. One doctor described the lesions using language that left nothing to the imagination. She could not comfortably hold food in her mouth. The first nurse who encountered her described her as looking like an apparition, thin, undressed, disoriented in the way of someone who had not had reliable physical care in a very long time. She was, in her own estimation, deeply uncomfortable with how she looked. The surgery to repair the damage to her face was extensive, and it worked. The lesions were removed. Her face was reconstructed. Her health stabilized. She regained weight. Her doctors, led by a physician named Henry Singman, recommended strongly that she return home to her apartment. She refused, not because she was confused, not because she didn't understand what they were asking, but because she looked at that hospital room, the clean walls, the controlled environment, the nurses who came when called and asked nothing of her socially, the meals that appeared without negotiation, the world outside reduced to a window she could keep covered, and she recognized it as the place she wanted to be. She transferred to Beth Israel Medical Center when it merged with Doctors Hospital, and she never left. She paid $829 per day to stay there, which worked out to approximately $400,000 per year, year after year, for the next 2 decades. Her room was on the 11th floor and had a view of Central Park that she kept permanently obscured. She lived under a false name, Harriet Chase, with a card taped over the actual room number bearing the designation 1B. The room was guarded. Very few people outside the immediate circle of her nurses and doctor knew where she was. She was, by the hospital's own account, a patient who needed very little medical intervention for most of her stay. She was not deteriorating in any significant way. She was simply living there, in a room, watching her shows, the Flintstones, the Smurfs, whatever she had recently recorded, and arranging her dolls and talking to her nurse in French. The nurse, who had been assigned to her at random, a registered nurse named Hadassah Perry, became the most significant relationship of Huguette's final 2 decades. Hadassah Perry worked 12-hour days for Huguette, sometimes more. She brought soup from home. She sat with Huguette through the long hours of the day and the early hours of the night. She described, in later testimony, working more hours in Huguette's room than in her own house, missing family vacations, missing her children growing up because Huguette didn't want her to leave. In return, Huguette gave Perry and her family gifts that accumulated over the years into something staggering: a Manhattan apartment, cars, payments for college tuitions, medical expenses, cash. By the end of Huguette's life, those gifts totaled over $30 million. The question of whether that relationship was one of genuine mutual affection, or exploitation in one direction or the other, or some complicated mixture of the two, became one of the central arguments of the legal battle that followed Huguette's death. Perry's defenders insisted that she had given Huguette genuine care and companionship in the only form Huguette could accept, and that Huguette had given the gifts freely, knowing exactly what she was doing because she wanted to. Huguette's relatives argued that an elderly woman in a hospital, cut off from family and the normal structures of life, was inherently vulnerable to the kind of influence that a constant, intimate caregiver can exert. What is certain is that Perry was at Huguette's side when she died. Whatever else can be said about their relationship, that part is uncomplicated. Meanwhile, 3 properties sat empty: a 42-room apartment on Fifth Avenue, a 27-room mansion on a cliff above the Pacific in Santa Barbara, a 52-acre estate in New Canaan, Connecticut, with 22 rooms, 9 bathrooms, 11 fireplaces, a wine cellar, and an elevator, purchased in 1952 as a potential refuge in the event of nuclear war, that Huguette had never once spent the night in after buying it. All of them maintained, all of them staffed, all of them kept in readiness for a woman who would never come. In Santa Barbara, the estate manager, John Douglas, spent 35 years overseeing Bellosguardo, keeping the gardens trimmed, the chandeliers clean, the leather-bound volumes of Dante and Homer turned periodically so they wouldn't warp. He described the property with something close to reverence. The portraits of André still hung 2 to a room. The piano still sat in the music room. The Stradivarius violins were still in their cases. Everything was where Huguette had left it in 1953, preserved across the decades like a room that expected its owner to walk back in at any moment. She never did, but she paid to keep it ready, every single month. Segment 4. The Mansions That Waited. What money kept alive? Bellosguardo cost $40,000 per month to maintain, not for extraordinary repairs, just to keep a 27-room oceanfront mansion clean, staffed, and in what Huguette specified as first-class condition. Across the decades, no one from the family set foot inside. The rose garden was tended, the library was dusted, the Renoir and Cézanne in the music room were properly maintained. Everything kept exactly as she had left it in 1953, because she paid for it to be kept that way. The apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue was similar. 2 full floors in one of Manhattan's most prestigious buildings, maintained by a staff who rarely saw their employer. And in Connecticut, a 52-acre estate purchased in 1952 specifically as a Cold War nuclear shelter, remote, invisible from the road, equipped for isolation, that Huguette had never once spent the night in after buying it. All 3 properties kept in readiness, year after year, decade after decade. In 2009, when Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Bill Dedman noticed the Connecticut estate listed for sale at $24 million, reduced from 35, and began investigating who owned it, his research eventually traced an elderly woman living in a Manhattan hospital room while these properties sat empty around her. When the story became public through NBC News beginning in 2010, the public reaction was bewilderment. People wanted an explanation that made sense. The answer, when a neurologist examined her in 2006, was quietly deflating. She was cognitively sound, cheerful, engaged, reading the Times, aware of the outside world, and choosing not to be in it. She had always hated being on display. The skin cancer that had sent her to the hospital in the first place had made that sensitivity physical and concrete. Even after reconstruction repaired her face, she would not go back outside. The illness had simply named the thing she had always felt. The mansions were not status symbols. They were security, options she was not yet ready to close. She was a woman who could not leave rooms behind, and so she kept all of them, year after year, on the chance that someday she might return. In 2005, after decades of her lawyers asking, she finally agreed to write a will. Segment 3. 2 Wills and a Fortune. The Final Battle. By 2005, Hugette Clark was 98 years old. She had been living in Beth Israel Medical Center for 14 years. Her lawyer, a man named Wallace Bock, who had worked for her for 15 years, had been asking her for years to make legal arrangements for her estate. Her accountant, Irving Kamsler, had joined those requests. The matter was urgent in the way that such things become urgent when the person in question is approaching their 100th birthday and holds a fortune that conservative estimates placed at over $300 million. In March of 2005, she signed a will. It was a relatively straightforward document. It left $5 million to Hadassah Perry, and the remainder of the estate, by default, with no explicit bequests, to Huguette's relatives, the descendants of her father's children from his first marriage, a group of about 19 people who were Huguette's half-nieces and half-nephews and their own descendants. Most of them had never met her. The last time any of them had seen her in person was 1957. A few had sent Christmas cards to her apartment for years, year after year, without ever receiving a reply. 6 weeks later, she signed a second will. The second will was entirely different. It left nothing to the relatives. Instead, it directed the bulk of the estate, approximately 75%, to charity, primarily through the newly created Bellosguardo Foundation, and a bequest to the Corcoran Gallery of Art. Hadassah Perry was to receive a further $30 million from the estate. in addition to the gifts she had already received during Huguette's lifetime. The goddaughter Wanda Steicher, daughter of Huguette's painting teacher Tade Steicher, and one of the very few people who had maintained genuine contact with Huguette through the years, was to receive approximately $12 million. Bock and Kamsler, the lawyer and accountant who had drafted the will, were each named to receive $500,000 and were appointed as executors of the estate and trustees of the new foundation, positions that would entitle them to additional fees. Beth Israel Medical Center was to receive $1 million. A Claude Monet painting from the Water Lilies series, purchased directly from the Bernheim Jeune Gallery in Paris in 1930 and not publicly displayed since 1925, was left to the Corcoran. When Hugette Clark died on May 24, 2011, 2 weeks before her 105th birthday, with Hadassah Perry at her side, 19 of her relatives emerged to contest the second will. Their argument was that Huguette had not been mentally capable of making her own decisions, and that the people around her, Perry, Bock, Kamsler, had used their access and her vulnerability to redirect her fortune. As evidence of mental incompetence, they cited her love of dolls, her passion for cartoons, her tendency to give money freely. Huguette's supporters responded that a woman who was lucid, engaged, reading the newspaper daily, and making detailed decisions about her art commissions and doll arrangements was not mentally incompetent, and that the idea of using someone's harmless eccentricities as proof of insanity was both legally questionable and personally insulting to her memory. The investigation that followed uncovered several uncomfortable facts. Kamsler, the accountant who had been entrusted with Huguette's affairs and was named as an executor in her will, had pleaded guilty in 2008, 3 years before her death, to attempting to disseminate indecent material to a minor online, a felony. He had remained in his position, managing Huguette's finances after this. Bock, the lawyer who drafted both wills, was both the draftsman and a beneficiary of the document, a combination that legal experts described as deeply problematic. The New York State Attorney General's office entered the case to represent the interests of the charities that stood to benefit from the second will. There were also reports of the hospital attempting to pressure Huguette into larger donations during her stay, suggestions that the institution had, over the years, sought to position itself advantageously with respect to her fortune. The hospital received its $1 million bequest in the settlement and faced ongoing legal action from the foundation and family to recover more. The Degas pastel that had apparently been stolen from her Fifth Avenue apartment shortly after she entered the hospital in the early 1990s, a work called Danseuse faisant des pointes, surfaced when the FBI began investigating it in 2005 and informed the Kansas City art collector, who had innocently purchased it years earlier, that it had likely been taken from Huguette's collection. That investigation ran separately from the estate dispute, but underscored that the years of Huguette's hospitalization had not been without exploitation. The settlement, reached in September 2013 on the eve of what had been scheduled to become a jury trial, divided the estate in a way that satisfied almost no one entirely. The 19 relatives received a total of $34.5 million. Perry received nothing from the will and agreed to return $5 million of the gifts she had received during Huguette's lifetime, while keeping the remaining $26 million or so. Bock and Kamsler forfeited their bequests and their executor appointments. The Corcoran Gallery received $10 million. The bulk of the remaining estate went to the Bellos Guardo Foundation, along with the doll collection, valued at approximately $1.7 million, and the art. Bellos Guardo itself, the 23-acre oceanfront mansion in Santa Barbara, was transferred to the foundation for the purpose of arts programming and public access, fulfilling what appeared to have been Huguette's genuine intention. that the house should be useful to people, not just maintained in perpetuity as a monument to a family that had ended. In 2023, Bellosguardo opened to the public for the first time. The chandeliers were cleaned. The piano was still in the music room. The portraits of André still watched from the walls. Segment 2. The woman inside the story. Who she was when no one was watching. For much of the public coverage of Hugette Clark's life and death, she was presented as a riddle, a pitiable eccentric manipulated out of her fortune, or a sad woman who had wasted her life. The coverage focused on the mansions, the dolls, the cartoons, the money, and the people fighting over it. The person at the center received considerably less attention. The people who actually talked to her described someone quite different. Paul Clark Newell Jr., a distant relative who maintained phone contact with her beginning in 1994, spoke with her regularly over nearly a decade. His account, formed into the biography Empty Mansions with Bill Dedman, described a woman who was lucid, warm, and genuinely engaged with a world she had chosen not to inhabit in person. She was funny. She asked thoughtful questions. She had made her choices and lived inside them with what appeared to be genuine contentment. When her goddaughter Wanda Steicher lost her own mother, Huguette told her that she must not live alone. She said it without irony. It was advice from someone who understood the cost of the choice she was describing. She was generous across her entire life in ways that went well beyond the $30 million given to her nurse. She found people in the newspaper who were struggling and sent money. She kept the bird refuge named after André, funded by Huguette in 1928, maintained for nearly a century. She paid her employees well and gave Christmas gifts to the Bellosguardo staff she hadn't seen in decades. When the daughter of the estate manager wanted to walk through the house one more time, Huguette gave the order that she should be let in. The door was opened. The chandeliers were sparkling. Barbara Doran said she felt Huguette's presence there, more vivid for the physical absence than it might have been otherwise. Her father had told her no one would truly love her. Her sister had died before she could understand how to exist without her. Her marriage had been a transaction. The world had interrogated her, watched her, and eventually fought over her money. Through all of it, she had kept her apartment, her paintings, her dolls, her routines, and her sense of what made a day worth having. She was not broken by what happened to her. She was shaped by it, entirely and permanently, into something the world couldn't quite categorize and therefore couldn't quite leave alone. Segment 1. The Last Years and What Remains. Hugette Clark died on May 24, 2011. She was 104 years old, early morning. The city already awake outside the window she had kept covered. In the weeks before, her condition had declined enough that she was moved to intensive care and then to hospice. Hadassah Perry, the nurse who had been at her side for nearly 20 years, was in the room when she died. There was no funeral. Huguette had long said she didn't want one, and she didn't want priests. A Catholic priest was summoned anyway to give last rites. On the morning of May 26th, before the cemetery gates opened to the public, she was interred in the family mausoleum in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, the same mausoleum where her father and her mother had been placed before her. She never made it back to Bellosguardo. She never stepped back into the apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue once she left for the hospital in 1991. The Connecticut estate, purchased as a Cold War shelter, remained unused through the full span of the Cold War and beyond, then sold. The Fifth Avenue apartments were sold. 2 units fetched $48 million combined. The estate settled in September 2013. The Bellosguardo Foundation took possession of the Santa Barbara property. In 2023, it opened to visitors. A portrait of André still hung on the wall. A doll collection worth nearly $2 million went to the foundation. 3 Stradivarius violins were catalogued and distributed. The Monet went to the Corcoran. The Degas that had been stolen from her apartment in the early 1990s was eventually returned to the estate by the collector who had unknowingly purchased it. The paintings she had made across her long life, portraits of women in kimonos, self-portraits, a Spanish dancer, a ballerina, were exhibited publicly in Santa Barbara in 2022 for the first time since 1931. People who attended noted that she was good, better than good, genuine talent used across a century. She was a woman who decided, early and finally, that the world was not a safe place to be fully present in. Given what the world had done to her, it is hard to argue she was wrong. She lived in a hospital room for 20 years, and by the only measure she cared about, was she living the way she wanted to? The answer was yes. The chandeliers at Bellosguardo were sparkling. The portraits were clean. The dolls were arranged exactly as she had specified. When she died, the world that had watched her from a distance finally stopped guessing and started looking at what she had actually left behind. It was more than anyone had realized. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.